Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is American Perspectives. Our video today is about the difference between governing and ruling. And there's a great deal of difference. Many people might assume that the two things are kind of the same. All right? The people who are elected to the government end up making laws. Well, laws and rules are kind of the same thing, right? And so if you're governing, you're ruling. Well, is that really the case? And the answer, I believe, is no. That's not the case. Governing is not the same as ruling. So the question is, what's the difference between governing and ruling? It's not that there's not maybe a little bit of overlap, but the general focus of governing, I think, is different than the focus of ruling. Governing, I think, has to do with managing and organizing and assuring that in society we have a level of fairness. People have the right to equal access, equal opportunity, equal pay for equal work, things like that. And so we need a society that works for everyone, and it has to be structured in a way so that people's needs are met. There need to be enough houses so that people can either buy or rent a house and have a place to live. There needs to be enough cars so that people can buy a vehicle of some sort to get back and forth to work or the doctor or school or the grocery store, whatever it is they have to go. People have communication needs. There are just all sorts of structural things that need to be managed. And I think governing involves some level of managing and organizing those things and structuring society in a way so that it works for everybody. That's basically, I think, how you would define government. Now, the primary job of government is securing the right of citizens, the rights of citizens. We have rights, and the government's job is to make sure we have those rights and that those rights are not infringed on. That's their primary job, okay? But in doing that, somebody has to manage society. Somebody's got to take care of the roads and the bridges and all of the different things that are part of our daily society, so that we can do what it is we do as people. See, and that's part of what government does. Big part of what government does. Well, what about ruling? What is ruling? Well, ruling is different. Ruling is about control. Ruling is about ordering people. Ruling is about demanding. I mean, you've seen movies, read stories and things like that about Europe and the monarchies and the divine rights of kings, and they are rulers, and their word is, iron, and what they say goes. And if you talk about rights, well, there is an awful lot of talk about rights when you have rulers who are ruling, you see. Well, that brings up a question about the difference between citizens and subjects, okay? We refer to ourselves as citizens, don't we? I mean, we don't refer to ourselves or think of ourselves as subjects. And the difference between citizens and subjects is huge. It's huge. I mean, it's almost like there's two completely, totally different kinds of things, and it's hard to even talk about them in the same sentence or the same paragraph because they're just so different. You see, citizens have rights. Subjects don't have rights. I mean, just think about that. Think about back to the Middle Ages. Think about in the feudal days of Europe, and the lord who lived in the castle and the people who lived on his land and worked his fields and things like that. Now, there were some good, benevolent lords who were nice to their people, but the simple fact is, if it came down to it, other than the Lord simply being a nice guy and saying, yeah, sure, okay, go ahead. It was still, to use the phrase, by his leave. Okay, he decided whether they could or couldn't. Even who could get married and who they could marry and all those things. Subjects don't really have rights. Citizens have rights. In our founding documents, it talks about the rights that we have. In the Declaration of Independence, it talks about life, liberties, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, see, those things apply to citizens. Those are rights that we have. But those things don't really apply to subjects. They just don't have that same enjoyment. They don't have that same possibility. They don't have those rights. You see, citizens consent to be governed. And this is huge. We're going to get to that a little bit more in a moment. But this idea of the consent of the governed was very big with the founding fathers, and the right of the people to decide, to in effect be the government. That was very crucial in the planning stages of our republic. Citizens, or rather subjects, don't have those rights. The powers that be don't have to have the consent of subjects. They don't need the consent of subjects. They're the rulers, so they're going to rules. But you see, in our society, in the United States of America, elected officials need the consent of the governed. They have authority, but their authority is derived from our willingness to give them that authority. See, and that's very important. I think we forget that sometimes. I want to read something to you in a moment here from the Declaration of Independence. But first, I want to show you this. This is a really neat little book. I think on Amazon, I paid $6 for this, maybe $7, maybe it was $6.99, I don't know. But it's not expensive, and it's an excellent book. It contains the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and all of the amendments, as well as other historical documents. So this is a really good reference tool that you ought to have. And there are several out there. There's one much smaller than this one, but it's the Constitution, and it costs like $1.99. Okay? If you don't have a copy of the Constitution somewhere, if you don't have the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and things like that, you ought to get one, and you ought to take the time to read it. I think many people have never read our founding documents. They don't understand what the founding fathers intended for our country to be. So this is something that I would encourage you to get. Now, I want to read just a small portion, just a paragraph from the Declaration of Independence, and you may recognize these words. I'm going to start in the second paragraph of the Declaration. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Now think about what that says. This, I mean, just that one little section, and that's just part of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It talks about the fact that governments exist or at least our government exists in order to secure our rights, our unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's their primary number one job. You often hear in the news, news pundits and others will say, well, you know, as commander-in-chief, the president's most important job is national security. He's the leader of the military, and he's got to make sure we're safe. And that's okay. I think I understand what they're saying. But when you're talking about the government as a whole, the primary job, the most basic responsibility of government is to see that we have our rights, that our rights are not being infringed in any way, shape, or form. Well, think about what's been going on in the last few years and in the last couple of weeks. The week of January 6th, 2021. Just think about some of the things that have happened in the days following those horrible events in the Capitol. People's freedom of speech have been denied. Now, the people denying it come up with all kinds of good arguments to say, yeah, but look at what they're saying. They're saying this, they're saying that, and this is horrible, and it can't be allowed, and blah, 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 you know. And yet, you know, 6 months, 8 months before, they were saying some very, very similar things themselves. And so, you know, there seems to be a little bit of inconsistency there. But rights, you know, are being denied. Religious freedom is being denied. Freedom of speech is being denied. The freedom to keep and bear arms is being infringed upon. And there are people who would be absolutely delighted if that was taken away altogether. One former justice of the Supreme Court, I believe it was Justice Stevens, wrote an article that was published in the New York Times saying that the Second Amendment was outdated, it should be repealed, it should be eliminated. People don't need to have the right to keep and bear arms. They shouldn't have the right to keep and bear arms. Well, you know, the Founding Fathers didn't agree with that. That's why they put it in there in the first place. And there's some awfully good arguments for why people need to be able to keep and bear arms. So what we're learning here is that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, has some very specific things in it that are expectations for the government. And one of those is to see that we have our rights protected. But then almost immediately after that, the Declaration of Independence talks about the power that the government has to do what it needs to do derives from the consent of the governed. That's you and me. That's us. The consent of the governed. What does that mean, the consent of the governed? Well, you know, some people would argue that if you vote for candidate A and candidate A gets elected, then you have consented to what candidate A does when he's in office. And that voting for a candidate is the consent of the governed. I would argue that that's not the case. You just because you vote for somebody doesn't mean you're giving them carte blanche. Doesn't mean that you're saying to them, okay, whatever you come up with, I consent to that. See, that doesn't work. People can come up with some pretty goofy things depending upon the situation and other things that they might be reacting to or whatever. And, you know, just giving them freedom to do whatever and say, well, you elected me, therefore you consented, you gave me the power to do this. I think that's not the best way to explain that. The consent of the governed has to be an ongoing consent of the people for what their elected officials are doing. And guess what? If their elected officials do not measure up, if they're not doing what the people think they should be doing, or not doing it the way the people want them to do it, then the people have recourse. What's going on in the state of California right now is a perfect example. Governor Newsom is likely to be recalled because people in California are very unhappy with what he's doing. There are over 1 million people have signed documents saying we want to recall Governor Newsom. Just because you get elected doesn't mean you're going to serve your entire term. And even if you serve it, doesn't mean you're going to get reelected, because the people may not appreciate what you do and the way you do it. We need, as citizens who have rights, we need to think about these ideas of the consent of the governed and the limits that elected officials have to be aware of in what they do and how they do it. So let me ask you this. Do you feel like anyone is really very concerned about your consent? Do you feel like any of the elected officials at your state level or at the federal level are really very concerned right now about the consent of the governed? I think they should be. You know, the consent of the governed, that idea is what I think underlay the idea that President Lincoln articulated when he spoke about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. How can the government be of the people, by the people, and for the people if the elected officials aren't concerned with what we think? If the consent of the governed isn't a daily concern that they have for how they are behaving, for how they're doing their job, for how the decisions that they make impact our lives. You see, I think that's a very important question, and I think it's one that you should discuss with your elected officials. As always, I hope you've enjoyed what we've had to say today, and if you did, maybe you'll hit the thumbs up button down below, which basically, says that you like what you're hearing. Maybe hit the subscribe button. Doing those things helps the channel quite a bit, and we appreciate you doing that. So thank you for tuning in today, and hope you will in the future. Thank you.